There are places in this world where the walls themselves seem to remember, where the ground beneath your feet holds secrets too heavy to bear. Last Breath Estate was one of the most profitable plantations in the American South during the 19th century. But behind its grand facade and pristine cotton fields lay a reality so brutal, so systematically cruel, that even today, historians struggle to fully comprehend its scope. This is not just a story about slavery. This is a story about a place where death became routine, where human lives were measured only by their productivity, where the pursuit of wealth created a machinery of suffering that operated with cold, calculated efficiency. What really happened within those gates? How did hundreds of souls simply vanish from historical records? And why has it taken us nearly 2 centuries to confront the full truth of what occurred at Last Breath Estate? Stay with us as we uncover documents that were never meant to be found, testimonies that were deliberately silenced, and archaeological evidence that cannot be denied. Leave your opinion in the comments. Do you believe we have a responsibility to confront these dark chapters of our past, or are some secrets better left buried? The year was 1798. Cornelius Whitmore III stood at the edge of 2,000 acres of Louisiana wetland, envisioning something grand. He was a third-generation plantation owner from Virginia, but he wanted more than his father's legacy. He wanted an empire. The land was purchased for a fraction of its potential value. The soil was rich, dark, and perfect for both cotton and sugarcane. But Whitmore understood that land alone meant nothing. What he needed was labor. Massive, unrelenting, expendable labor. By 1800, the first group of enslaved people arrived at what would become Last Breath Estate. 63 men, women, and children purchased at auction in New Orleans. They were immediately put to work, clearing the dense Louisiana wilderness, draining swamps, building levees, and preparing the land for cultivation. The conditions were merciless from the very beginning. The Louisiana heat during summer months regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity made it feel even hotter. Mosquitoes carried malaria and yellow fever. Snakes hid in the tall grass. The work was backbreaking, the hours endless. Whitmore's vision for his mansion began to take shape in 1802. It would be a monument to his success. A 3-story Greek Revival masterpiece with towering white columns, intricate ironwork, and imported marble. But every brick, every column, every ornate detail was laid and crafted by hands in chains. The estate's main crops were cotton and sugarcane, 2 of the most labor-intensive crops known to agriculture. Cotton required constant attention, planting, chopping, picking. Sugarcane was even worse. The harvesting and processing demanded round-the-clock labor during the grinding season, often lasting 18 to 20 hours a day. By 1810, Last Breath Estate had expanded to hold over 200 enslaved people. Whitmore's production numbers were impressive, even by the brutal standards of the time. His cotton yields broke regional records. His sugar was considered premium quality. He was wealthy beyond measure. But there was something else in those early records, something that accountants and overseers noted with disturbing casualness. The mortality rate at Last Breath Estate was significantly higher than other plantations in the region. In a typical year, Whitmore could expect to lose between 15% and 20% of his enslaved population to death. This was not accidental. This was the business model. Whitmore operated under a cold calculation that horrifies us today, but made perfect economic sense to him. It was cheaper to work people to death and replace them than to maintain them in merely brutal conditions. Enslaved people could be purchased. Medical care cost money. Rest meant lost productivity. The arithmetic was simple and monstrous. The enslaved people lived in rows of crude wooden cabins behind the main house, far enough to be out of sight but close enough to be controlled. These structures were barely more than shacks, dirt floors, no windows, gaps in the walls that let in rain and cold. Families of 6 or 8 would share spaces no larger than 10 feet by 12 feet. There was no privacy, no comfort, no mercy. And this was only the beginning. Because what happened at Last Breath Estate over the next 6 decades would reveal just how far human cruelty could extend when one group of people held absolute power over another. What do you think of what you've seen so far? Does it shock you to learn just how calculated this cruelty was? Leave your thoughts in the comments as we continue deeper into this disturbing history. In 1887, nearly 22 years after the end of the Civil War, a trunk was discovered in the abandoned overseer's house at Last Breath Estate. Inside were ledgers, journals and correspondence that had somehow survived decades of neglect. These documents would remain in private hands for another century before historians gained access to them in 1987. What they revealed was beyond what anyone had imagined. The journals belonged to Samuel Brennan, the head overseer at Last Breath Estate from 1835 to 1862. Brennan was not an anomaly. He was typical of men in his position, literate, efficient, and utterly indifferent to the suffering he oversaw. His journals were not confessions. They were work logs, and that somehow makes them even more chilling. Brennan documented everything with bureaucratic precision. Daily production quotas, punishment schedules, mortality rates. He recorded these horrors the way a factory manager might record widget production. The quota system at Last Breath Estate was designed to be impossible. Each enslaved person was assigned a daily picking quota for cotton, 200 pounds for adults, 150 for teenagers, 100 for children over 10. These numbers were approximately 50% higher than the averages at neighboring plantations. Missing quota meant punishment. The first offense, 10 lashes. The second, 25 lashes plus reduced rations. The third, confinement in what Brennan coldly referred to as the box, a wooden coffin-sized structure where people were locked for up to 3 days in the Louisiana heat with no food and minimal water. Brennan's journals reveal that the quota system was deliberately set too high. The purpose was not motivation. The purpose was to create a perpetual state of fear and exhaustion that would prevent any organized resistance. But the quotas were only part of the system. Brennan documented an elaborate hierarchy of punishments for various infractions. Speaking back to a white person, 20 lashes. Attempting to learn to read, 50 lashes plus branding. Trying to escape, 100 lashes, often fatal. Administered in front of all other enslaved people as a warning. The medical situation was documented with the same cold efficiency. The estate employed no doctor. When people became ill, they were given 3 days to recover. If they could not work after 3 days, their rations were cut in half. If they still could not work after 1 week, they were considered losses and left to either recover on their own or die. Brennan's entries from the summer of 1854 are particularly revealing. That year, a yellow fever outbreak swept through the slave quarters. Over the course of 3 months, 47 people died. Brennan's response was not to improve conditions or provide medical care. His response was to note the loss in productivity and to recommend purchasing replacements at the next New Orleans auction. The living conditions in the slave quarters were documented in correspondence between Brennan and Whitmore's son, who had taken over management of the estate. The letters discuss whether to repair the cabins or simply let them deteriorate further. The decision: no repairs. The reasoning: enslaved people needed only minimal shelter, and any investment in their comfort was wasted capital. By the 1850s, the population at Last Breath Estate had grown to over 300 enslaved people, but the turnover rate was staggering. Records suggest that over the estate's 60-year operational period, more than 1,000 individuals were held in bondage there. Yet at no point did the population exceed 350. Where did they all go? Behind the estate, hidden in a dense grove of cypress trees, was what Brennan referred to simply as the backfield. This was the burial ground for enslaved people who died at Last Breath Estate. There were no markers, no ceremonies, no records of individual identities. Bodies were wrapped in canvas and buried in mass graves, sometimes 3 or 4 deep. Brennan's journals mentioned the backfield only occasionally, and always in the context of logistics. How many bodies? How deep to dig? Whether quicklime was needed to accelerate decomposition during humid months. These were not considered people deserving of memorials. They were considered problems of waste disposal. One entry from December 1857 is particularly haunting. Brennan writes about a woman named Sarah, who was in her final stages of tuberculosis. Rather than allow her to die in the quarters, potentially spreading the disease, she was moved to an isolated shed. Brennan notes that she died 3 days later and was buried immediately. He records her death not with her name, but with her assigned number, 63. This was the machinery of Last Breath Estate, efficient, documented, and operating with the full knowledge and approval of its owners. This was not cruelty born of passion or individual sadism. This was systemic dehumanization as business practice. Thank you for staying with us this far. We know this is difficult to hear, but it is crucial that we bear witness to these truths. The most important revelations are still ahead. For decades, historians believed that almost no first-hand testimonies from the enslaved people of Last Breath Estate had survived. The written record was controlled entirely by the enslavers. But oral history, passed down through generations of descendants, preserved what the official documents tried to erase. In the 1970s and 80s, researchers from Louisiana State University conducted interviews with elderly African Americans whose ancestors had been enslaved at Last Breath Estate. What emerged were stories that had been carefully preserved through family tradition, passed from grandparent to grandchild, kept alive even when it was painful to remember. One of the most significant testimonies came from the descendants of a woman known as Mama Rose. According to family oral history, Mama Rose was brought to Last Breath Estate in 1842 when she was approximately 16 years old. She had been trained as a midwife and herbal healer in her previous location, skills that made her invaluable in a place where medical care was non-existent. Mama Rose's story, as preserved by her descendants, reveals the impossible position of enslaved healers. She was expected to deliver babies, treat injuries, cure diseases, all without proper tools, medicines, or even basic supplies. When people died under her care, which they often did given the conditions, she was blamed and punished. But Mama Rose also became the keeper of memories. In the secret moments between dusk and full darkness, she would gather small groups and tell stories. Not just any stories, but the stories of those who had died, their names, where they came from, what they loved, who they left behind. This was an act of profound resistance. In a system designed to erase individual identity, to reduce human beings to numbers in a ledger, Mama Rose insisted on remembering them as people. Her descendants estimate she memorized and preserved the names and stories of over 200 individuals. Another testimony comes from the family of a man named Solomon, who was known as one of the most skilled blacksmiths in the region. Solomon was valuable to Whitmore precisely because of his skills, which gave him slightly better conditions than most. But those conditions came with their own form of torture, watching others suffer while being powerless to help them. Family accounts describe how Solomon would deliberately work slowly on certain projects, finding small ways to resist and delay. He would repair shackles in ways that made them more likely to break. He would shoe horses in ways that would cause minor discomfort, making them less reliable for slave patrols. These were tiny acts of sabotage, But in a place of absolute powerlessness, they were acts of dignity. The testimonies also reveal the deliberate strategies used to separate families. Children as young as 8 or 9 would be sold away from their parents, often without warning. Husbands and wives were kept at Last Breath Estate only if both were considered productive. If one became ill or injured, they would be sold to a trader who specialized in purchasing damaged slaves for resale at discounted prices in the Deep South. One testimony describes a morning in 1856 when a mother named Dinah woke to find her 3 children gone. They had been sold overnight to a trader passing through. Dinah's screams were so loud and so anguished that she was whipped unconscious. When she recovered, she stopped speaking entirely. According to the oral history, she never spoke another word for the remaining 7 years of her life. This was not unusual. It was policy. Separation was used as both economic practice and psychological control. The message was clear. You own nothing, not even your relationships, not even your children. The testimonies also speak to the systematic sexual abuse that occurred at Last Breath Estate. Several accounts describe how young women were regularly assaulted by white overseers and even by Cornelius Whitmore himself. Children born from these assaults faced a particular cruelty. They were often sold away quickly, as their existence was a visible reminder of the crimes committed by their fathers. One story tells of a young woman named Letty who resisted advances from an overseer. Her punishment was severe. She was whipped, then locked in the box for 5 days. When she was released, she could barely walk. She died 3 weeks later from infected wounds. But perhaps the most heartbreaking testimonies are those about attempted escapes. The Louisiana landscape made escape extremely difficult. Swamps, rivers, and the ever-present threat of slave patrols meant that very few attempts succeeded. Family accounts describe multiple escape attempts, each ending in recapture and brutal punishment. One testimony tells of 3 men who tried to escape together in 1849. They made it nearly 40 miles before being caught by a patrol with bloodhounds. They were brought back to Last Breath Estate, whipped until unconscious, then forced to dig their own graves. They were made to stand at the edge of those graves, while Brennan explained that mercy was the only reason they were not being buried in them. One of the 3 men, a young man named Jacob, died from his injuries 2 days later. He was buried in the grave he had been forced to dig. These oral testimonies, preserved across generations, provide something the written records never could: the humanity of those who suffered at Last Breath Estate. They were not numbers, not property. They were people with names, with families, with dreams that were systematically destroyed by a system built on their exploitation and suffering. The Civil War reached Louisiana in 1862. Federal forces captured New Orleans in April of that year, and the old order of the Deep South began its violent collapse. For the people enslaved at Last Breath Estate, the war brought both hope and new dangers. Cornelius Whitmore IV, grandson of the estate's founder, was serving as an officer in the Confederate Army. His wife, Margaret, remained at the estate with the overseer Samuel Brennan and a handful of white employees. As federal forces moved deeper into Louisiana, the situation at Last Breath Estate became increasingly unstable. In September 1863, approximately 80 enslaved people from Last Breath Estate escaped during the night. They fled toward Union lines, which were then about 30 miles south. Some made it, many did not. Those who were recaptured faced execution, not by formal process, but by informal violence. Brennan's final journal entries mention these events only briefly, dealt with the runners, problem resolved. By early 1864, with Confederate control of the region collapsing, Margaret Whitmore made the decision to abandon the estate. She took what valuables she could carry and fled to relatives in Texas. Brennan disappeared as well, taking his journals with him. The remaining enslaved people were left at the estate in a strange limbo, still not free by law, but no longer under direct control. When Union soldiers finally arrived at Last Breath Estate in June 1864, they found a scene of desolation. The great house had been partially looted, the fields were overgrown, and scattered throughout the property were the remains of those who had not survived to see freedom. After the war, the Whitmore family never returned to Last Breath Estate. Legal ownership remained in their name, but the property was effectively abandoned. Over the following decades, the Grand Mansion slowly deteriorated. The slave quarters rotted and collapsed. The fields returned to wilderness, and then came the deliberate forgetting. In the decades following Reconstruction, as the Jim Crow South established its own mythology about the antebellum period, places like Last Breath Estate became inconvenient reminders of uncomfortable truths. Local histories of the region began to omit mention of the estate entirely, or referenced it only vaguely as a former plantation. The Whitmore family descendants, who had relocated to Texas and later to California, reinvented themselves entirely. They changed their business focus, distanced themselves from their Louisiana past, and eventually, some branches of the family even changed their surname. By the 1920s, few people outside of local African-American communities even remembered that Last Breath Estate had existed. This erasure was deliberate and systematic. Parish records that might have documented the true conditions at the estate were lost in convenient fires or floods. The land itself was sold and resold through shell companies, making ownership history difficult to trace. The backfield, that mass burial ground, was deliberately planted over with fast-growing trees to obscure what lay beneath. For over a century, Last Breath Estate existed only in the memories of descendants and in scattered, incomplete records. Then came 1987. A team of archaeologists from Tulane University received permission to conduct a survey of abandoned plantation sites in Louisiana. Last Breath Estate was included almost as an afterthought. What they discovered shocked even experienced researchers who thought they understood the brutality of slavery. The first excavations of the backfield revealed what oral testimonies had long claimed. This was a mass burial site of staggering scope. The initial survey identified at least 273 individuals buried in unmarked graves. Many were buried in groups of 3 to 5 people, their bodies simply stacked in trenches. Analysis of the remains told stories that documents never could. Bones showed evidence of malnutrition, chronic disease, and frequent traumatic injuries consistent with beatings. Many skeletons showed signs of hard labor damage. Compressed vertebrae, worn joint surfaces, stress fractures that had healed and rebroken multiple times. Perhaps most disturbing were the remains of children. Over 60 of the identified remains were of individuals under the age of 15. Many showed evidence of the same labor-related injuries found in adults. They had been worked like adults. They had died like adults. The archaeological team also discovered evidence of the punishment system, iron shackles, the remains of the box, a structure that appeared to be a whipping post with ground-level iron rings for securing people during punishment. When news of the discoveries began to spread, there was immediate pushback. Some local groups argued that the excavations were unnecessary disturbing of the past. Some descendants of plantation owners in the region expressed concerns about how these findings might reflect on their ancestors. There were even attempts to halt the archaeological work through legal challenges, but the evidence could not be denied. The remains were there. The artifacts were there. The truth was literally in the ground, waiting to be acknowledged. By 1990, the full scope of what had occurred at Last Breath Estate was becoming clear. This had not been just another plantation. This had been a place where human life was systematically devalued to a degree that shocked even those familiar with the horrors of slavery. And yet, even with all this evidence, the cover-up was not entirely over. The archaeological findings received minimal media coverage nationally. The site was not immediately preserved or memorialized. For years, it remained in a kind of limbo, acknowledged by academics, ignored by the broader public. Today, if you travel to the location where Last Breath Estate once stood, you will find a landscape that bears few obvious marks of its terrible history. The grand mansion collapsed in the early 2000s, its final walls giving way to decades of neglect. The land has been partially reclaimed by Louisiana wetlands. To a casual observer, it might seem like just another patch of overgrown southern wilderness, but the ground remembers. And increasingly, people are demanding that we remember too. In 2008, a coalition of descendants, historians, and civil rights organizations formed the Last Breath Memorial Project. Their goal was clear: to properly memorialize the site and to ensure that what happened there would never be forgotten or minimized. The project faced immediate challenges. Funding was difficult, the land ownership was complicated, and there was resistance from some quarters who argued that focusing on such painful history was divisive or unnecessary. But the descendants were determined. For them, this was not abstract history. These were their ancestors. The people buried in that backfield were their great-great-grandparents, their great-great-aunts and uncles. They had names that Mama Rose had remembered and passed down. They had stories that deserved to be told. In 2015, the Last Breath Estate site was officially designated as a historical landmark. A memorial was erected at the entrance to what had been the backfield. The memorial lists the names of over 150 individuals who have been identified through a combination of archaeological evidence, historical records, and oral testimony. But the memorial also acknowledges a painful truth. More than 100 individuals buried at the site remain unidentified. Their names are lost. All that remains is the knowledge that they existed, they suffered, and they died in a place that treated them as disposable. The memorial has become a site of pilgrimage for descendants. On the anniversary of Juneteenth each year, families gather there to remember. They bring flowers. They speak the names of ancestors. They tell stories that have been passed down through generations. They ensure that these lives, though stolen and brutalized, are not erased. The Last Breath Memorial Project has also worked to contextualize this history within the broader American experience. They have developed educational programs for schools, created documentary resources, and partnered with universities to ensure that what happened at Last Breath Estate is studied and understood, because this history matters, not just as a record of past wrongs, but as a foundation for understanding present injustices. The wealth generated at Last Breath Estate did not disappear. It was invested, it was inherited. It became the foundation for family fortunes that still exist today, though the connection to their source has been obscured by time and deliberate forgetting. Meanwhile, the descendants of those who were enslaved at Last Breath Estate have inherited a very different legacy: generational trauma, disrupted family connections, and the systemic disadvantages that flow from centuries of exploitation and denial of opportunity. This is not ancient history. The last person born into slavery in the United States died in 1971. We are only 2 to 3 generations removed from these events. The consequences are still unfolding. There are also broader questions that Last Breath Estate forces us to confront. How do we memorialize sites of atrocity? How do we balance the pain of remembering with the necessity of not forgetting? How do we ensure that acknowledgement of past wrongs leads to meaningful action in the present? These are not easy questions. There are no simple answers, but the work being done at Last Breath Estate offers a model. Tell the truth, name the victims, acknowledge the perpetrators, create space for grief and for learning. and most importantly, connect past injustices to present inequalities. Some people ask why we need to focus on such painful history. They argue that it happened long ago, that we should move forward rather than dwelling on the past. But those arguments miss a fundamental point. We cannot move forward from a place we refuse to acknowledge we have been. The people who died at Last Breath Estate, who suffered unimaginable cruelties, who had their humanity denied and their lives stolen, they deserve to be remembered. Not as abstract victims of a distant past, but as individuals who lived and loved and hoped, whose potential was destroyed by a system built on their oppression. And we, the living, we have a responsibility to bear witness, to ensure that their suffering was not meaningless, to commit ourselves to building a world where such systematic dehumanization cannot happen again. Last Breath Estate stands as a testament to both the worst and the best of humanity. The worst, what we are capable of when we dehumanize others. The best, the resilience of those who survived, who resisted, who remembered, and who passed down their stories so that we might learn from them. The ground at Last Breath Estate still holds secrets. There are likely more remains to be discovered, more stories to be uncovered. The archaeological and historical work continues. Each new discovery adds depth to our understanding of what happened there. But beyond the academic research, beyond the historical documentation, Last Breath Estate stands as a question to all of us. What will we do with this knowledge? How will we honor these lives? What will we do to ensure that the systems that allowed such cruelty do not manifest in new forms? These questions do not have simple answers, but they are questions we must continue to ask. The story of Last Breath Estate is one that many would prefer to forget. It is uncomfortable. It is painful. It forces us to confront aspects of our shared history that challenge comfortable narratives about progress and justice. But forgetting is not an option. The people who suffered and died at Last Breath Estate, whose names we know and whose names we do not, they demand our remembrance, not for the sake of dwelling in pain, but for the sake of truth, for the sake of justice, for the sake of ensuring that we never again create systems that treat human beings as disposable. Now we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on how we should memorialize sites like Last Breath Estate? Do you believe that confronting these painful histories helps us build a better future, or do you think there are dangers in focusing on past injustices? How do you think we should balance the need to remember with the need to move forward? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and this conversation is important. If this video made you think, if it challenged you, if it moved you in any way, please consider subscribing to this channel. We are committed to telling stories that mainstream history often overlooks, stories that are difficult but essential. And before you go, click on the next recommended video where we explore another hidden chapter of American history that will change the way you understand the present. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And most importantly, thank you for remembering.